Blog Talk Radio.
Uh-oh, guess what day it is?
Julie.
Huh?
Julie.
Huh?
Guess what day it is? Guess what day it is? Guess what day it is?
Anybody? Anybody?
Mike.
Huh?
What day is it, Mike?
Huh?
Woo-hoo! Leslie, guess what today is? Leslie, guess what today is?
It's Hump Day.
Hump day!
It's Hump Day.
Hump day!
Yes, this is the Donelson Files. Tom Donelson. Coco Konski may or may not join us. She had some family issues that she's dealing with. So we will, but there's a chance that she may call in and talk about the most recent decision by the Trump administration of vaping and what they're going to do. But tonight we got on our line a good friend of the show, Pam, and one of the things, and I'm going to let Pam kind of talk about it. We're going to kind of talk about generalized version of cold cases, but we're going to also talk about what's her thoughts on the Epstein case and some of her theories, and then we'll maybe go through some older stories, and then we'll move on from there. And at the end of the hour, Dr. Larry's going to join us, and we're going to go from 6:30 to about 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with a Donelson Files Dr. Larry show. We're going to talk about the Democratic debate. We're going to talk about other issues dealing with the Democrats, and we're also going to do a 9/11 and 9/11 as well. So basically, stay tuned because we're going to basically kind of combine both shows at the end of this hour and going into the next hour. This is Tom Donelson. We're a part of the Bachelor Radio News Network. And Pam, welcome on the show.
Thank you, Tom. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. All right. Okay. I mean, like I say, first of all, just kind of generalize your background.
I started. Oh God, I would age myself, but basically I started. I know I started in the '80s working in counseling. Alcohol and drug abuse, and moved over to working with mentally ill and criminally mentally ill people, and retired in '07, so that tells you how long I've been out. And I did profiling. Back then, that's what it was called, but I think nowadays they call it situational analysis and things like that. Each people back then, it was we didn't have a lot of law enforcement that were trained on how to do things and talk to people and crisis response and things like that. So that's pretty much my history with that. Since then, I've actually taken it on and done what you and I were talking about, the historical forensics. And try to deal with that. So, hang on a second. I gotta put this up. But I tried to go into historical forensics is pretty much taking a story from history and validating it, and seeing if it's true, not true, and what actually did happen, and what didn't happen. So that's the kind of stuff I did. And that's the stuff I do now. That's the stuff I like doing, and it's just a hobby. I've helped work some cold cases for people where they've actually asked me to look for, do behavioral analysis to see what might have happened or things like that. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. It helps quite a bit because I know you kind of made a comment that I made a slight mistake in introducing you last night when we were talking about you coming on the show. So we wanted to I figured I'd let you do some background.
I worked for the state of South Carolina, but I helped out people in Wyoming. I worked situations that as far away as Colorado, Georgia, of course. Back then, everybody was in the same boat together, Washington, D.C., that kind of thing. It was like a small group of people, basically. Everybody knew everybody, and there was a network like that. We didn't have the computer stuff as well as you do now. This was by phone and foot. So.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm going to ask you to be obviously, amateur. I'm not going to use the word. Here's what I'm going to kind of actually talk about some of the Jeff Epstein case. We'll talk about his hanging, but I'm also kind of curiosity about his personality and some of the things that you would have noticed from afar. Obviously, I mean, you can't say you didn't, and actually talk with the guy, see the guy, and have that kind of contact. But
correct, it's an amateur guesstimate. Yeah.
Yeah. So
it's an amateur guesstimate like everybody else.
Yeah. But let me start off right off the bat. Okay, you've seen the evidence. I mean, you've talked, and it's been ruled a suicide. The majority of people will say something happened. Nobody's really trusting the official story. So I guess the question I'm going to ask you is, first of all, number one, is it your belief that it was suicide?
Yes. Yes, I pretty much. Well, the last piece that came falling through the cracks was him doing the will and completing the will. And on a behavioral type of situation, and I hate using the word and I hate using this term, but I'm going to go ahead and do it because I talk very straight up. It's a classic suicide setup, where he may or may not have made a first attempt, but we know that he probably wanted a cell to himself. They put him in a cell by himself because he was suicidal. I'm guessing they did that. That's usually protocol in most of the prisons and jails, and put him on watch and did all that. Well, being under camera, he can't really do anything, paper, whatever. So usually if you think outside of the box, if you think about people who talk suicide, a lot of people say they're not going to do it, and then they do it. But there's a setup before that, and usually you hear about people giving away all their possessions. And that was the key for me when he did the will, and he seemed extremely happy, according to the attorneys who said they saw him last. I'm like, dang, And also the day before, or that morning before, all that information dropped about his other cases, I guess, or the cases that were out there. All of that information, all that freedom of information stuff, I guess it was, I don't know, but all of this stuff dropped that morning, and if he'd have been visited by his attorney, they probably told him. But he had already done the will. And that was the clincher for me. It's like, if you look at it outside the box, why hadn't he done a will before? He was a rich guy. Most people do wills and things like that. Why did he change it and send it to his brother? That is the whole thing to me that made it seem more like I'm pretty okay with them saying he committed suicide. And I'm a conspiracy theorist like anybody else, but yeah, that clinched it for me to where I'm like, this guy set it up. He set up to where he was probably, if you see most prison stuff, they go in and they talk to other guys, they hear from other guys, they know the staffing schedules, they know when there's staff there and when there's not. I think he set it up to do it himself. I think that's why he was so happy the last time he saw his attorneys. He knew he was going to do that.
All right, that's kind of interesting because somebody would say I would have guessed the complete opposite. He's happy, as if I'm going to get off this thing, because certainly up to this point, he pretty much had gotten away with everything. It just seemed like he was, you look at the entire case, and and my first thought, this guy got a light sentence. And let me put it this way: is there any aspect of this personality that, again, from afar, that you would say, up to this point, he was confident enough or narcissistic enough to say, nobody can touch me?
Well, here's another little twist. Hanging is a narcissistic thing because there's no blood. There's no mess. I'm sorry, but he keeps himself intact. And that's a personal opinion on that from watching people and how they act and stuff. But yeah, I think instead of being narcissistic, as we would consider narcissism, I believe probably he was a little bit more on the sociopathic side and thought he actually could get out. And when he couldn't figure it out, he had made a plan. Like this guy was had to have been a planner to amass that much money and do all those things. So this was just like a business deal. I'm going to commit suicide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so.
a while back. I mean, once you and I had a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was something you mentioned to me, dealing with what was the woman that he worked with.
Correct.
Correct, and I think you kind of indicated that maybe there was something there to protect her, or
Correct.
keep her out. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit more?
Well, I mean, it's just from what you hear from the news and just what you hear about it. But yeah, I did do a little history and started digging a little bit and looked into her history, and her father apparently was found drowned. He was had a lot of money and was drowned or found to have drowned, off of a boat
mm-hmm.
while naked, which is pretty bizarre. But apparently Papa had a lot of the same kind of lifestyle that Epstein had. Now, I'm just throwing that out as far as me personally, Joe Public looking at and going back and looking at the history of her, the history of her father. Epstein's history, everybody knew, but who were those people around him? And those are the histories you, to get a good round figure, want to look at. And, it would be protecting her.
Well, let me throw this one quick question, then we're going to go on a break. You protect. I'm looking at this guy, and what I see is a guy who's, it's about me. There's that aspect of him, and I just find it interesting that of all the people, why would he be protective of her, or is it she was the keeper of his secrets?
She was the keeper of the secrets. Yeah, she was the keeper of the secrets, and I think they made an agreement a while back. If anything happened to either one, they would probably do this. But that's me. That's just an opinion. That is not anything. That is not a professional opinion. That is just seeing that. I think it's quite interesting that they seem to have found her, and then they can't find her, and then they find her, and then they can't find her.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's quite interesting. I don't think people change their behaviors a whole bunch.
All right. We'll be right back here. A quick message about another great program on the Bachelor Radio News Network. This is Tom Donelson with the Donelson Files with our special guest, Pam.
If you want to hear another view of the latest developments in Trump's Washington, listen to the Dr. Larry Show. Every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern. Dr. Larry is a former businessman, entrepreneur, college president, and author who provides background and context for current events and trends in politics, education, foreign policy, and religion from a conservative perspective. Tune in and hear the other side as Dr. Larry talks with Washington insiders exclusively on blogtalkradio.com and the podcast at thebachelorpadnetwork.com.
Yes, don't forget to turn to thebachelorpadnetwork.com. You can listen to all of these past programs of ours, including Dr. Larry, Daily Bachelor Pad, Locker Talk, and maybe in Sandy's Secret. So basically, all you got to do is get on the website and then pick out the show that you want to listen to. Like, for example, last night's adventure in the Donelson files would be one good example. And Coco was on fire dealing with the vaping issue, and she may join us a little bit later as well. So, yeah. So just again, like I say, and at the end of this hour, at the half hour, again, will be, Dr. Larry's going to join me, and we're going to be kind of spending the next 90 minutes after that together. And Pam, if you want to stick around and join us in the conversation, feel free. I don't know if you've ever talked with Dr. Larry. I've listened to him.
No, you're the first person that I've talked to that I like your show, because you do all different kinds of views. You show both sides of the story. So. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. Back to this. Okay, the Epstein. Obviously, you're going to disappoint our audience by saying the Clintons didn't do it.
I think this is way above. If you think about it, and you think about the monies involved, and you think about, on a global scale, this is way above and beyond them. And I mean, I would let law enforcement, deal it out, and DOJ, I believe, is investigating, and I'm pretty confident that, they'll turn over every stone, and look at every aspect of it. But right now, I think this is way above and beyond the Clintons. I really do. I know about all the conspiracies. You see all that coming across the internet and stuff. But I think this was too much money. I mean, they were looking at him for money. You know that, but
Yeah. Well, yeah, because he was a donor, I guess, to the foundation, among other things.
Correct.
So, and he was a
correct.
He was a donor to politician. So it's we have
correct.
all
I don't
that.
think he was making any money off of them. I don't think he was making any money off of them. I'm pretty sure it went the other direction. So.
Well, usually the Clintons, that's usually been the case.
But that's what I'm talking about, looking outside the box on a case and looking outside. Yes, there is the trend and the obvious, and you think about these connections, and you can go there and you can work with that, and you can look at it and believe it, and that's okay. I don't, have a problem with that. I was just telling you my personal opinion when we were talking about it. He did the classic setup for suicide. And how he got a cell to himself, how he got on an isolated ward where you had limited staff. You can't tell me the other fellows that were locked up in there did not know that, So he might have been smart enough to set that up himself. And then there's the conspiracy theories. So.
Yeah, there's conspiracy theories. So okay, I was like I said, because there was you and I have talked about this, and you've always been very cautious in how you set these things up. Very kind of briefly before we get into the forensic side, and again, I know you can't talk about any specific cases. When you look at a cold case, or somebody calls a cold case, what are some of the first steps you would you do? Because obviously you're looking at a case that it's cold case for a reason, because nobody's been able to find, solve the case, or at least solve the case to a legal satisfaction that somebody can be convicted. And let's just say, and you got a case that's years old, or what are the first steps?
Yeah.
What's the first step that one would do?
Well, what I do. This is what I do. Is most things hit the newspaper and hit the news outlets. You have that to start with. And you can try to find as much information from reporters who have, and there's a lot of good newspapers, and I know the news media is not doing good, but there's a lot of those, what I call the first interviews, where you can gather just from a little bit of snippet of here and there and wherever, the first interviews. Then I get a map, and I will sit with a map. And I will look at where, let's say, I'll give you an example, a missing person. presumed to be deceased, and possibly not in a good way. But I will look at a map, and then I will look at where this person has lived before, who their friends are, where their friends are at, who's around them, is there a trend there with these group of people? Is there any ties with anybody in the area, say that's doing time or something like that? You know, sometimes you can find that information out, general public-wise. And I'm speaking to you as a citizen, right? Not as anybody involved in anything like that, but just as a regular person. And you get trends. You'll see trends. An example was one missing girl that I was looking at, this case. There was an entire group that seemed to all live together. Then they lived in this part, and they lived in this apartment complex, and they lived in this trailer park for a while. And then but there was 6 or 7 of them that seemed to intermingle. Like one would be living with this guy, and then the next year or so you could find them living with the other guy in the group, you know, and then they would be switching partners, but they all stayed together like that TV show Friends. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes.
That old sitcom show, it was just a group of them was always intermingled together no matter where you went. And I thought that was quite interesting in looking at the dynamics of this and what happened. And as a general, that's where I go with a lot of that, looking at the maps, looking at that, looking at the histories, looking at who's going, you know, what's doing what. It's a lot of, I do it old-fashioned way. It's a lot of footwork a lot of times, whereas you actually go physically and stand at the last known location and look and see, well, if I were doing this on my own, and I look at weather patterns. I look at, like I say, there's one that I was doing. I look at weather patterns. Was it raining the night they were missing? What was the weather like? Where was the tide? This occurred down in Charleston, of course. Where was the tide? Where are the river currents on the Cooper? Where's the river currents on the Ashley? How high was the river? You know, and I'll go back to the old maps from that area. Because the newer map, if it's an old case, you know, you're going to have a change in architecture around there. So I go at it like that, and then try to pinpoint, you know, if this was nefarious, where would this have occurred at, that kind of thing. It's interesting when you do that. I'm just giving you that one example.
Yeah.
But
let's just say as a follow-up. A lot of part of that footwork. You know, with somebody like yourself or anybody looking at a cold case, obviously you would, I'm going to assume you're going to interview friends or interview people involved in that case. Would you be able to put together something, or do you do that?
I am very, as a citizen, I'm very reluctant to go interview people involved in the case. You know, you might find an officer that has picked up the cold case. But I would, at some point, I would always get somebody else involved if I were going to go do something like that. Yeah, sometimes you can walk into a bar and find people still talking about it, and that's you know, one thing. But to actually go play PI, oh no.
Okay.
I do it.
No, you wouldn't do it.
I do it. I talked to a mother of a missing person, but that case was over 12 years old, you know.
Yeah.
But there was an officer, you know, that you could report to. Also, who, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wasn't a dead case, but it was a cold case.
Cold case, yes. So, if you talk to anybody, it would be more or less law enforcement.
Pretty much. If I were, these days you just don't want to do the PI thing unless you have a license to be a PI. And as a citizen and stuff, looking at like the Epstein case, you know, there's no way I would ever be going up there and talking to anybody or doing anything like that. No, you don't do it. You get the information from where you're at, which is, you know, the best you can do.
Okay, let's Now,
Missing people, I do go look at a little bit more.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah. Okay, as a follow-up to that, obvious, the newspaper accounts, how important would something like that be to you, going through newspaper accounts?
Only 50%. Now, locally, all right, you're in Indiana? Right.
I'm in Iowa.
On a local level,
Iowa.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Well, shoot, excuse my French. Y'all got lots of good newspapers up there. You know which newspapers are reliable and which ones have good stories and which ones actually have interviewed people really well. A lot of times when you go back historically, you can find more accurate reporting because there wasn't a tendency to be flamboyant or trying to sell a newspaper. I'm trying to be nice about the word, but it wasn't sensational.
Yellow journalism.
It was just black and white reporting. Yeah, it was black and white reporting. And a lot of those accounts you can find and find some fairly decent interviews and see who the people are involved and look at them. But these days there's also a fine line, and I would point out to you there's also a fine line in looking up people's histories and stuff. You just really don't want to go too far with that. You can. That's why I went and started working more on historical stuff. And we're talking about I'm a Revolutionary War history mystery person.
Okay, it's fine. I don't know if years ago the History Channel they would have these. Well, I'm not sure. I'm gonna have to. I can't remember the names of the show. The name of the show, but they would have this show, Battleground Detectives. That's what it was called. And they would literally, go back to the battlegrounds and start figuring out, what happened.
Right.
And I don't know if you ever saw that show. I mean, one of the more interesting one was, the little bighorn, how they, kind of looked at the little bighorn. And I always thought that was one of the most fascinating program, because basically when I was, looking at, when they were looking, they were one of the things that, I never really thought of at the time. What they kind of brought up, they said, well, first of all, the Indians had better weapons. They had Winchesters, versus carbines. And Winchester could literally get 10, 12 shots off, whereas while the carbine was basically a longer range weapon, you're getting 3 or 4 shots per minute in the hands of somebody good versus, let's say, getting 10, 15 per minute.
Right.
In other words, they were outgunned. And that. Right. And I know, we've talked about, in the pre-thing, we talked about this. So we'll go real quickly. We're going to take a quick break. This is Tom Donelson on the Donelson Files, where Coco Koski is out for today on a family emergency. She might join us a little bit later, depending on the circumstances. All right. So this is, again, on the Bachelor Radio News Network.
Hey, this is L.A. Bachelor reminding you, if you're looking for real discussion on sports, politics, religion, and other topics, you need to join us on Mondays at 6 p.m. Eastern at WCOMFM.org, on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. at blogtalkradio.com/LA-Bachelor, and on Thursdays at the same web address. Follow us on Facebook at Pad Nation, on Twitter, Pad Nation, the number 2 at Twitter, LinkedIn, and you can email us with your requests, your comments, your concerns, anything you want at our email address at LABachelor with a T, BATCHELOR 40 at gmail.com. Follow us on Facebook and Pad Nation, Instagram, and of course, if you missed any part of our broadcast, make sure you go to thebachelorpadnetwork.com and listen and enjoy the Bachelor Pad.
That's right. The Bachelor Pad follows our show every Tuesday. And again, the BachelorPadNetwork.com. You can get past episodes in case you missed any, or you just simply want to go back and just re-listen to a show. And as on the Donelson Files, we got quite a few shows that you may just want to go back and re-listen to. So Now, we're now going to kind of move over to the forensic history, which you've talked about, Ed. I know you've got some interesting cases, but first, when you do a historical, and your specialty is the Revolutionary War.
Mm-hmm. Well, that tends to have most of the battle sites here in South Carolina. So.
Yes. Yeah, actually, interesting enough, because I live in Marion, Iowa, which is right outside of Cedar Rapids, and Marion, Iowa was actually named after your swamp fox, Francis Marion.
Yep.
And which like I said, I have no idea how it is Iowans decided, let's go name this guy after the Revolutionary history, but it is, and they even have a swamp fox festival every September. So, yeah. Okay, before we get into specific cases, okay, what's the first thing you do when you look at a forensic case, historical forensic case? What's the first thing that you're going to do in preparing to go look at a case? Well,
it's the same pretty much. I put myself in the period of when it happened. Some of the stuff that I have looked up recently that I would talk to you about happened either during the Revolutionary War or immediately prior to. Now, we're talking about 1773, going back that far. Going back to see where the Lord proprietors gave the land to whoever, and I have those maps that I go and I actually physically look these things up and see, could this have happened in this area? You hear these stories and you hear different stories. It's kind of like following that, but I look up and see, okay, who owned the property? Who was this person? Is there anything anywhere in anybody's archives on this person? And, yeah, there's beaucoup of books on Francis Marion, but some of the other aspects of it that you and I were talking about happen to be one of the legends here in South Carolina, a legend story. Another woman that I was looking up, the same thing, I ended up doing a lot more research on her father, and then I ended up going through and having to look at censuses and things like that, and anyone can do that to see actually did these things actually happen in the way in which the story comes out. What's the true story? I look for the maps, and then I start looking at the people. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, where would you go to get? Because obviously you're talking about 300 years ago, almost, or 250 years ago, and obviously the geographics totally changed. So, where you, is there what particular?
I've actually gone. Well, on example, one case was here. It's a gentleman that's buried in a pauper cemetery. And I ended up going to Barnwell County, which was the county seat at the time, and trying to find out what happened. And, of course, when Sherman came through during the Civil War, he burned the courthouse and all those records. But they had copies of those records at the archives here in Columbia. And I just got lucky on that one and figuring out what happened to this gentleman. How did he die, basically, is what I was looking up, and what were the circumstances around it at the time. On this other gentleman, it was I found I found the information from the royal newspapers over in England, and that I could find on the internet, believe it or not. It was the Great Britain Public Records Office information. And I found what the British say happened. And then I went back and started looking at the people that were involved in what happened. And that happened to do with Francis Marion, if you want me to tell the story of Harry.
Harry the Spy. Yeah.
Yeah, Harry was. He's called Headless Harry. Was the story, and I was always fascinated by this because the Lake Marion is covering where the original plantation and town and all that was. But Harry was a slave belonging to a British loyalist. His name was Mr. He was a property of Mr. Gilliard, who was in Charleston. And Harry had free reign, but he was employed, according to the British Public Office, he was employed as a spy by order of Lord Rawdon, in which capacity he was very serviceable, and that after his lordship's departure, he was employed in the same manner for the late Commandant Lieutenant Colonel Balfour and enrolled as a guide in the Quartermaster General Department. So that was Harry, but Harry was sent to Monk's Corner, and according to the British, he was taken prisoner by Francis Marion's troops or party, and he was beheaded and his head was set upon a stake. And when General Gould's army passed the Greenland swamp, they could see that this is what happened to their spies. Well, when I started looking this up a little bit more, Marion's troops weren't anywhere near there. And I started digging a little bit further and found that Marion later married a lady, or I think she turned out to be his cousin, and she was Mary Vidot. And she owned quite a bit of property because her father died, her two brothers died. Anyway, she ended up with this great barony here in South Carolina, and everybody loved her. From what I could find from all the records and things, everybody loved this woman. She was one of the people that taught everybody to read and write. They had to read and write. They had to do this. They had to do that. She's pretty firm. And there's funny stories about her being married. I'm pretty sure that it was her people that did this, from what I could tell. And when I see her people, they were freed and non-freed, you know.
Yeah. So you're saying some of her slaves may have been involved in the murder.
Oh, yeah. Yes, according to as the loyalty that I saw in the paperwork that they paid upon her. And if you ever visited her grave site, which I did, and he's buried there also, but you will see how much they loved her, which is fascinating.
Well, let me ask you. Let me kind of go back. The point is, because you're making the case where the Swamp Fox had nothing to do with it, but she did. Now this was before they got married.
Correct.
And I
don't know what she did, but I know that because her. I guess you might want to call it a plantation. I called it a barony because there was like 7 or 8 properties there together, and she heard about Marion's exploits. She admired him for a while. They were cousins, I believe, and they did not get married until after the war.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure her people and her were loyal to him. So.
Okay, so
she had a crush on him.
Yeah. Well, I guess the question I would throw back is, let me put it this way: would it have been dangerous for her? Because obviously, you did essentially have a civil war in South Carolina between the Loyalists and the Revolutionaries. I mean, you have, if I read in my history correctly, it wasn't just the British, but the Loyalists themselves.
Correct. Oh, yeah, that was some bloody stuff going on there.
And in fact, so the question I would throw back is, would she that? I mean, I guess the question is, I'm trying to figure out. This is, this sounds like to me a woman who's perfectly willing to do what it takes to advance the revolution and to help Marion's cause. Is that something that you found, through the records and guessing at her personality, that was something she would be capable of doing?
Oh, yes, sir. I do believe that she was capable of doing that. As a matter of fact, one of the funny stories about Marion after he married her was one of the stories, this you can find in some history books because everybody thinks it's funny. But before he could go into the house, he had to throw his hat in the door. If she wasn't angry at him, the hat would stay. And if she threw the hat back out, he could come in the door.
In the door, yes.
And a friend of his was riding by one day and said, he saw him without his hat on and said, Francis, what's going by? General, they called him General, said it's terrifically hot out here in the sun. Why don't you go in the house? And he answered, it's hot out here, but it's a damn sight hotter in the house. Because she would get angry, and if he, did something wrong. But they had actually a small home, comparatively to what you think with Gone with the Wind and all that. It was a relatively small home, and it was called Pine Bluff, and it is now underwater. But it's
okay.
Their grave sites
Okay.
are not. Their grave sites are at another place.
Hold on to that thought, and we're going to be right back. This is Tom Donelson, but our special guest Pam. On the other side of this, Dr. Larry will be joining us. This is Tom Donelson, the Donelson Files on the Bachelor News Radio Network.
Join Barry Barnes for Locker Talk on the Bachelor Pad Network as he presents NFL news and evaluates players. Fridays at 9 a.m. Eastern at blogtalkradio.com.
Hello, this is Sandy Eason, the host of Sandy's Secrets. Come and join us, where we will be talking about women's issues of sexuality, sensuality, and self-love. We'll be coming soon, exclusively on the Bachelor Pad Radio Network.
And also, you can catch Sandy Eason at hopefully, we're going to try to get her back at the fourth week of September for our monthly relationship shows with Sandy and Coco, and they're I don't know if you or Dr. Larry heard the last show. Let me put this one. What I heard is, they really got into some very interesting items. We got Dr. Larry on the phone. Dr. Larry, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. I heard part of that, and I thought I'd better block my ears.
Yeah, well, the thing is, when you got Coco and Sandy, nothing is off limits. Yeah. So, all right, well, first of all, I want to thank Pam for kind of talking about the forensic side of the equation, the Epstein case. And, Pam, feel free to stay on the air. I've got you on the air. Feel free, because I'm going to kind of ask the both of you kind of real quick. When you think of 9/11, what are your thoughts? Maybe, first of all, what's your memories of that particular day? And I'll
Who first?
Pam.
Goodness gracious! I was working, and when we saw the first tower get hit, there was a TV on somewhere, and somebody said, "Oh, a plane went." Well, I don't know if you recall, but recently a plane, or before that, a plane had hit the Empire State Building, a small plane. So you're not thinking too much. It was the second plane. When you stop and you look, it was the second plane where everybody was like, "Oh my God." And then, like I was talking to you earlier, I had a friend that had just taken a job at the Pentagon. That hurt. So.
Mm-hmm. So was she hurt or anything involved in the plane crash at the Pentagon?
I did not see her name there, but when you think about it, it's like I spent. She was like a person that crunched my numbers for me when I was at Carolina. She was an experimental psychologist, and wow, it was just that your heart just dropped, and then your heart dropped more, and then it was like, okay, what do we do? So.
Yeah.
Yeah, my memories
about you, Dr.?
Mine are somewhat similar, but not quite as direct. We were watching it on television, and all of a sudden, my daughter, who had an office down there in the right on the hill, pulled into the driveway. We live on a small farm outside of Washington, and she had a whole car full of girls that were from her office, and they were scared. I mean, really scared, because when they heard about this and they decided that the Capitol might just be one of the next targets, and so they got in the car, and as they were coming across the 14th Street Bridge, that's when they saw the plane hit the Pentagon. And if you ever want to see a bunch of scared young women, boy, that was them. And of course, then we all sat around the TV watching the bad stuff.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, I mean, what my memory, because at the time I was in my last couple of years in the pharmaceutical business, and I was out doing the runs, and again, I heard about the first crash, and then you heard about the second. And I remember in an office, and we were this was about the time when the whole thing came crashing down, and you're just watching this, and they're like, you can't. I mean, you were like, you could not believe what you were actually seeing. That it was just crumbling down. And at that point, I remember there was a message on my answering machine on my phone, and they said, it was the company saying, get your butt home, stay home. We don't know what's going on, but just go home. And I know I've had a couple of friends of mine who, I have one gentleman who basically worked at the time, the Wall Street Journal, when they had an office in that area. And, some of the stories he was telling me, it was rather quite harrowing. But that's, and I know my daughter now works at the 9/11. My youngest works at the 9/11 Museum. And if you ever want to go to a site that, again, it's just,
your daughter
the word
worked
holograms.
Your
Well,
daughter worked
now.
in,
She works now.
in the World Trade
at the 9/11 Museum. Yeah, she works now at the 9/11 Museum.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But she wasn't
and it's kind of interesting.
She wasn't in the World Trade. She wasn't in the World Trade building. Yeah.
No. She, like I say, she works there now.
Yeah.
But it is, like I say, it is. It's a very fascinating when you go through there, because you have the fountains, you got all of the names of everybody, and then the museum itself is kind of interesting as well. It's essentially, it's the bottom, what's left of the original Twin Towers that you're going through. So it's.
I haven't seen that.
Yeah. Well, like I say, if you ever get to New York, it's worth going through. It's worth going through. So. And so, all right. And I know we're going to talk more about this on the on your show as we move into our special edition Donelson Files and the Dr. Larry Show. And I guess I got a couple of quick questions here for the both of you, because you got the Democratic debate. And I know it's really exciting news. Yeah,
I love debates.
Yeah,
I love debates, and I love it. If I can catch it tonight, I'm going to try it, because I just love it. I just love that stuff. So.
Well, here's the, like I said, this is the first night that Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden will be on the same stage. So that's, to me, it's going to be quite interesting. And I've got, it's going to be, for me, my first thought was, Joe Biden just has to do one thing: stay standing, don't say anything stupid. But
I don't think that's in his personality.
Yeah. Well, actually, to me, the interesting thing, because Warren is now catching. I mean, there are a lot of polls where he's, they even show her now in the head. And I just saw a recent poll where she made an Iowa caucus. And again, Iowa's a tough state to poll. that she's taken the lead there. So it's going to be interesting to see where Joe Biden goes, whether or not he goes after her. There'll be at least an attempt by somebody. Because like I said, they're now on the same stage.
He won't go after her.
Good. You don't think so?
I'm just mad because
it's not in his nature.
Yeah, I don't think so either, but I'm just mad because they didn't let Tulsi Gabbard get up there and snit, a bit. But I think if you compare Joe to old Lizzie, Joe's going to look like a big old moderate, and I think that's where those, what I call the secret Democrats are, the old school Democrats. They're probably pulling for Joe because he looks more like a moderate. Of course, some of the things he said recently kind of scares everybody.
Well, like you say, if you look at his the last climate summit, I mean, what I got out of it, okay, we're not going to have oil, we're not going to have coal, we're not going to have nuclear energy, there'll be no more fracking. You're a sinner if you eat hamburgers. Yeah, I'm just thinking, man. And I've got myself.
You know how they say, don't come from thy guns? I'm sitting down here going, don't come from my bacon.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing.
Don't come from my bacon now.
Exactly. That's exactly what they're doing. But here's the thing that comes to my mind. What I was thinking of is, and my first thought was, when you look at some of these ideas that are being promoted out there, and you guys say to yourself, are these people that serious? I mean, for example, Yang has actually called for mirrors in space to deflect the sunlight away from the Earth. And I loved his line that debates, well, what's your solution? Live on higher ground. Move to higher ground. And some of these ideas, my first, when I'm looking at this, I'm saying, good luck trying to sell that to the American people. Tell them eating a hamburger is going to end the world. Or my favorite was, there actually were studies done on pets. I mean, they actually said, having pets is a cause of climate change.
Yeah.
And
but these are the same people who refuse to deal with GMOs, and GMOs could feed everybody. And you remember the corn? Do you remember a while back when they tried to do the corn car? I call them the corn cars. The vegetable alcohol stuff. Oh well, it was a while back, and
ethanol. Ethanol.
Yeah.
Well, they still do. Well, so they still do.
Yeah, well, they're finding out that that's toxic. So, whatever. Yeah.
Well, actually, my favorite story is, I don't know if you guys, my favorite story was, I got this from my friend of mine, sent this from South Dakota. And the thing is, they were sitting in South Dakota, basically what's happening is the wind turbines, when they run out or they have any problems, you got to do something with them. So, of course, what they thought, hey, let's go ship them to South Carolina and put them in there. Let the South Dakota, and let the South Dakotians take care of this and put it in their waste management. And of course, South Dakota said, "Oh no, we don't want we don't want your turbines." So you actually got a waste issue, with that.
Oh wow!
And my other favorite is that this actually happened in Minnesota in the last winter when they had a polar. Actually, there are two stories. One, some guy comes on, some climatologist tells the Minnesota legislature, never worry about it. It will never get below 10 degrees. This is about as cold as it's going to get. Beyond that, we're going to have mild winters. And a week later, you had a polar vortex where it was down to like minus 20.
Minus 34 in some areas out there, yeah.
Yeah. And then they turned around and had the wind, because they have been using more and more renewables. And, of course, the problem is the wind wasn't blowing. And somebody figured out if you put snow on a solar panel, it doesn't work either. And they literally had brownouts. I mean, can you imagine having a brownout in Minnesota when it's below 10 degrees?
Wow.
Yeah. utility.
Oh, the whole
they
thing is
literally
ridiculous. The whole thing is
Well,
ridiculous. You got the
little
entire
electric
world
cars-
depends on fossil fuels.
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
little
that's
electric
the other
cars
thing.
down here don't like the weather. So.
Yeah. Well, the other thing to me with an electric car, I've never seen, when people say to me electric car, and I say, do you realize electric car is 120-year-old technology?
It's a golf cart.
Yeah. But no, seriously, yeah, because they were electric, yeah. They golf, yeah, exactly. But they actually had electric cars at the beginning of the automobile era. And the combustible engine, won out. And it's self-evident because you have to charge the engine. And when I read that it takes like 3 to 12 hours to charge it fully, I'm thinking to myself, and you only get to go. I think now the newer ones you can go 200 miles. Now I'm going to put it this way. That means, Pam, you can go drive to Greenville, but you're not going to make it back to Columbia without a recharge.
Well, and another problem with that, Tom, is that the electric cars down here that my friends have, because they're all conscious, they don't like the weather, and it's about $600, sometimes $3,000 to get some of that electrical stuff done, because they don't like the extreme heat and humidity we have. And it gets pretty pricey to try to repair one of those little electric cars down here. But yeah, I can't get to your house unless you have a plug, and probably get halfway there. And let me try to find a plug in Missouri when I'm going through there. Okay? I'm sorry. We're not going to plug my car in.
Yeah, I mean, you're not. It's not. Lots of luck finding plugs. There are not that many outlets out. You go through Iowa, and I'm going to tell you something, because I just got finished taking a trip to Reno. On Interstate 80, and let me tell you, once you get out, let's say beyond Des Moines and beyond Omaha, there's not a lot of major cities that you're going to hit. So you get to Reno. And there's a lot of, let's just put it this way, there's, rest areas are like, they're 50 miles apart on the average. You might get a small town and get a couple, off, but it is not necessarily, it can be a rather nice, spacious drive. And then when you get to Wyoming, you go into the mountains. And then when you get to Nevada, you got, actually, that part of Nevada, you're actually still in the mountains. Because Reno is almost a mile almost a mile attitude-wise. But, yeah. I just say, I look at these, and of course, my favorite story now is Barack Obama buying a $15 million property front up there in Massachusetts off the ocean.
He only has 10 years to live in it.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, the sea's supposed to be rising, and you're getting beachfront property. So obviously, that comes into play. But yeah, I just say I looked at that thing, and my first thought was, because I've done enough polling over the years, when you tell people, then most people say, well, we got to do something about the environment, we got to do something about this, climate change, blah blah blah, and then when you start asking, well, how much are you willing to pay? It's like, and most, even those have been done by alarmists, and I've seen all these polls, and I've done this myself. Is if you're lucky, if anybody was willing to pay $10 a month, that's pretty much about as much as you're going to get. In other words, nobody wants to put in an extra couple bucks to save the planet, but they'll go ahead and use paper straws. So, all right, we're going to take a quick. Actually, what we are going to do, Dr. Larry, and Pam, feel free to stick around if you want. We are going to now do the official intro to your show.
Okay. you hear that trumpet, you know it's the Dr. Larry Show on the Bachelor News Network. And I'm Dr. Larry Fedewa. I'm your host for the hour. Tonight we are going to talk about our Day of Infamy, which was September 11th, 2001. My opening statement starts out with 18 years ago today, the American homeland was successfully attacked by foreign agents for the first time since the War of 1812, when the British burned the White House in Washington, D.C. The attack on Pearl Harbor, at the time a U.S. territory, occurred on December 7, 1942, and was called by President Roosevelt the Day of Infamy. Our first reaction was, of course, the heroic efforts of the victims and the first responders to rescue as many of the survivors as possible. The question quickly arose, however, what do these people from halfway around the world have against us? And that question has haunted us ever since. There are several factors to be considered, including some uncomfortable truths. A major consideration must be the nature of the ideology which motivated these perpetrators, namely the religion of Islam. There have been many assertions by both apologists and outsiders of the religion of Islam that claim it is at its core a kind and peaceful institution. That is only half true. It may apply to certain, quote, peaceful countries where Islam is the dominant religion. But the fact is that Islam was founded by a murdering warlord who slaughtered his own people on occasion. It is also true that every once in a while, when an Islamic civilization became accomplished and humane, a, quote, revival opposition force would rally an army and fight and defeat the advanced society with barbarism and cruelty. A good example of this is the Cordoba, Spain, the Caliphate of the 11th century, which was undoubtedly the most advanced civilization in the Mediterranean world, perhaps the entire world of its time. It produced immortal philosophers and artists who are still studied today. That territory was conquered by a desert revivalist army and thrown into a savage regime after a mere century of existence. And that has been the parallel history of Islam since its origins and remains today, especially in the Wahhabi sect supported by the House of Saud. Another aspect of the rise of the anti-American posture of modern Islam is simple jealousy. Until the proliferation of mass media technologies in recent years, America seemed a distant and unimportant place to most Islamists. The exceptions were areas where Americans were at war in local skirmishes, especially in the Middle East. But even then, there was no common knowledge of how the Americans experienced life. This all changed as mass media began to proliferate with its dramatic movies and television programs which documented in living color a way of life which had been heretofore inconceivable to the masses of the Islamic world. Compared to the squalor and poverty of most of these cultures, the American daily life witnessed on TV appeared incredibly attractive. For some, this apparition presented a goal to be sought after in their own country. For many others, however, the American way of life represents a huge social injustice. These people yearn to take away the wealth of the Americans through conquest, or at very least to destroy the American enjoyment of their wealth, and thus the rise of terrorism. Another enduring result of 9/11 is the self-examination we Americans are called to undertake. What is it that makes us Americans? What is it that we hold dear that distinguishes Americans from so many other people in the world, and that has allowed us to prosper? The answer many of us have found lies behind the word freedom. Freedom of the individual is the underlying theme of the Constitution, of all the struggles throughout our history, as we have continually expanded the boundaries of individual rights and opportunities. This concept of freedom has undergone a continual revision through the years to include more and more people, first slaves, then women, then all ethnic and religious members, racial groups, sexual distinctions, laborers, and union members. It has been a continual task because we have undertaken not only to secure legal acceptance, but also social acceptance of all Americans by the rest of us. In a sense, this quest is against nature, as traditionally experienced, in that humans have always identified themselves by their families, clans, and tribes. The American way has set out as our goal the acceptance of every other American into our own tribe, so that on a macro level we are all simply Americans, each with the same rights and responsibilities as the others. There are two dimensions to freedom. There is freedom from and freedom to. Freedom from refers to the lack of unreasonable constraints and is the principal concern of laws and customs as we have been discussing above. But ultimately, the most important dimension of freedom is freedom to achieve our maximum humanity, to do the best we can for ourselves and others, to pursue any opportunity we encounter, to live with the fullness of happiness that God has given us. That is the reward for our striving to provide the ultimate freedom from. It is a fact, it is to face a life and a world of freedom to. This is the precious heritage Americans have. 9/11 has reminded us that we must remain vigilant against those who would destroy our way of life. You are listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Bachelor News Radio Network.
Hey, this is L.A. Bachelor reminding you, if you're looking for real discussion on sports, politics, religion, and other topics, you need to join us on Mondays at 6 p.m. Eastern at WCOMFM.org, on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. at blogtalkradio.com/LA-Bachelor, and on Thursdays at the same web address. Follow us on Facebook at Pad Nation, on Twitter, Pad Nation, the number 2 at Twitter, LinkedIn, and you can email us with your requests, your comments, your concerns, anything you want at our email address at LABachelor with a T, BATCHELOR 40 at gmail.com. Follow us on Facebook and Pad Nation, Instagram, and of course, if you missed any part of our broadcast, make sure you go to thebachelorpadnetwork.com and listen and enjoy the Bachelor Pad.
You're listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Bachelor News Radio Network, and I'd like to welcome to the Dr. Larry Show Tom from the famous Files. So, Tom, what do you think of all this?
I tell you, I like your introduction because I think there's a. I've been thinking about this for a long time. I mean, it's like, and maybe one issues that is that there's an ignorance of the history in particular the European history and the Western civilization history between Islam and Christianity. What people don't tend to forget, it's like, maybe the best way I would say it is, mention the word crusade and see how many people you could upset. Well, you can't use those words. You can't use those words. But, it's like I don't know if you ever read the writings of Dr. Bernard Lewis. It was one of the, And, he kind of made the point, the Crusades were the counterattack. What people tend to forget, France nearly became part of the Islamic Empire, but they were stopped at the Battle of Tours in 732. You essentially had between 632 and 732, about 2/3 of Christianity was pretty well conquered around the Mediterranean. So you, in effect, had a simmering war between two civilizations. And in a way, I would say it would be the Polish army pushing the Turkish army back from the gates of Vienna. That pretty much ended the first phase of what you call a 1,000-year war. And sometimes we tend to, and for a lot of the jihadists, it's still there. It's that thought of the caliphate.
And we also have to realize that the mores of behavior in those days were considerably cruder than they are now, and that would also include the Christians. A lot of the barbarism that we saw, or that was experienced in the Crusades, was actually perpetrated by the Christian side as much as the other side. Yeah. But the Westerners the Christians tend to sort of outgrow that to a large extent. But the other side of it is that there's always been in Islam a kind of a reverence for the barbarity and the cruelty that is associated with the desert tribes, and that's not been true in the Christian side. I must say, there are certainly examples of Christian civilizations that were very rather barbarous, and you think of the Spaniards coming over to the North America, for example, or the British when they first went to India. But that's not really been ever glorified per se, like it is in Islam.
Yeah. Well, let me throw this back at this one, because here's the other aspect I find that I kind of find troubling with the media. And I've said this on the show, and I've had pushback from others on the network. But I've kind of made it clear, like Omar and Taliban, the lady from Michigan that was a Taliban, and Omar, I kind of view them as Jew-hating Marxists. And I think to myself, but here's the thing. I could read, there was about a month ago, there was Miss Iraq is now living in L.A. For those people who may not know the story, she appeared in a picture with Ms. Israel. I can't, with the Miss Universe contest. I can't, Miss Universe contest, and she was kind of, let's just say, it was rather controversial throughout the Middle East, including in Iraq, and she ended up having to move here to the United States. And somebody interviewed her and said, Omar doesn't speak for me. And I've always thought to myself, why don't we? Does the media not talk about like a Miss Iraq as an example? And there are others out there who are definitely modern, who are part of the American dream, and they're invisible. And I look at Omar, who hangs out with CAIR, the CAIR group, which is a front group for the Muslim Brotherhood. They have a relationship with Hamas. They've been co-indicted co-conspirators. And these are the people being given the headlines. And I keep asking myself, are these the people you truly want to parade? Or do you want to parade those Muslims who basically are assimilated, want to be assimilated within this culture, who love this country, and who are patriotic in so many ways, including serving this country.
It's a very it's a difficult perception to understand. I agree with you. I try to understand what must you be thinking to say and do some of the things that some of these people do. I guess it's a very limited view of life. I mean, it's like Colin Kaepernick, when he starts this whole little he got adopted by an American family and brought up and got a good education, became a great athlete, got a lot of money, and then all of a sudden he turns against it all. Or he said he doesn't want to honor the American flag. Of course, a lot of people said it was because he got involved with some girl. But what are people thinking of? It's just a very limited view, I guess.
Well, here's the other thing. Let me give you. Here's another name, Judy. Judy. That's G-U-J. It's a Z-U-H-D-I. Yasser. J-A-S-S-E-R-M-D. This is a gentleman who, again, he served our country. In fact, he served in one of the places he served. He served in off Somalia during the operation during the end of the Bush year, beginning of the Clinton years. And he has a group called the Muslim Reform Movement, where he's basically doing what he's doing to beat try to counter what he would view the radicalism of the jihadist side of the equation. And he's almost, let me put this way. Have you ever heard of this guy?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, well, exactly. And this is, to me, because in a way, maybe we're starting to forget what 9/11 was. It's like, okay, like when Omar said, well, something happened that day. Or
yeah, well, that's true.
Or like today, the New York Times, before they took it down, said airplanes hit their targets. Or something like that. And I'm thinking to myself, no, airplanes hit their targets. Well, who was flying the airplanes? What was happening? And there's a group, we are starting to forget what happened that day and why it happened. And so
I guess why it happened is still a little bit of a mystery. I mean, and when you stop and think of the national origin of what was it, 5 of the perpetrators, they were Saudis. Was it 5 or 6?
I can't remember.
Anyway, a majority of them were Saudis, and undoubtedly they were adherents to the Wahhabi version of Islam, which is a very crude and very authoritarian and frankly cruel version of life that is being taught by them. And of course, the famous bargain between the house of the Saudi king and the Wahhabi priests is considered to be the fundamental bargain that allows Saudi Arabia to exist, and yet now we've got I don't know, we've got the Saudis being our major allies now in the Middle East, aside from Israel, and it's just a really, it's a very strange world we're living in.
Well, actually, it's always been. Remember, historically speaking, you've always seen, strange alliances. The alliances themselves don't always exist, mainly because of like-minded people, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of individual.
Right.
For example, today, with the event, with Iran pursuing nuclear weapons, becoming a regional power, something that's happened, let's say, based on purposeful policy since between 2009 and 2017. And what you got with the Saudis is they're looking around. They said, look, they fear the Iranians far more than they fear us, or they even fear Israel. They're not worried about Israel attacking it, but they are worried about Iran and their allies attacking it. And that's kind of in the same way that Joseph Stalin woke up one morning on June the 22nd, 1941, and said, "Oh crap, Hitler's coming across the border." And all of a sudden we found ourselves with a new ally, who basically for 2 years previous was the enemy.
Yeah. So what do you think of the main takeaway now that we look back on 9/11 from 18 years ago?
To me, the main takeaway is what you kind of stated. Be vigilant. We still have enemies out there. The world is still a dangerous place. And I would take it even further. It's a world where alliances are changing in a different fashion than what, let's say, in other words, we're not living in the Cold War period anymore, or even, let's say, the 1990s, where we were the super power worldwide. Right. We live in a world where you have diversity. Maybe I'll go back to a book. The late Herman Kahn. I wrote the book called The Coming Boom. It was written in the depth of the recession of 1982. And he made two observations. First, he was basically saying there's a boom coming. And of course, in those days, you're living through the 1982. This was written during it was released pretty much during the 1981-82 recession. And for those people who don't know, you and I remember it. We were trying to cure a double-digit inflation, and unemployment was even higher than it was during the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the second thing he talked about was the proliferation of regional powers, where you would literally have rising powers like Iran, Japan, Brazil, Argentina, not all of them have come true, but he basically said they're going to be joshing regional powers in addition. And I think you look at that. There's no doubt in my mind.
Hold that thought, Tom. Yeah. And you're listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Bachelor News Radio Network.
Join Barry Barnes for Locker Talk on the Bachelor Pad Network as he presents NFL news and evaluates players. Fridays at 9 a.m. Eastern at blogtalkradio.com.
You're listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Bachelor News Radio Network. We're talking to Tom Donelson, and we're reminiscing a bit and trying to place our thoughts properly on this anniversary of our great, really one of the most deadly invasions or attacks that we've ever had on the American homeland, namely the 9/11 attack on the East Coast in 2001. And Tom, you were starting to talk about some of the historical antecedents. One of the things that really I think we overlooked a lot at the time were some of these really spectacular attacks on American military targets in the 1980s and 90s. You know, the coal and go ahead.
Yeah. Well, you had the USS Cole. That was 2000, but you also remember, okay, in Lebanon you had the attack on the barracks.
Yeah, right. All the Marines.
Where the Marines were, and that was one. So this has been going on for us, and even during, let's say, the Iraq War. If you read, I guess James Mattis, in his last book, basically talks about the fact that Iran was using proxy to attack Americans in Iraq. So it's.
Well, if you really want to talk historical antecedents, remember the very first military or naval encounter that the new American Republic had in 1797 was when they went over to the Barbary Coast and tried to rescue American hostages. I mean, that was our very first enemy.
Absolutely. You got to remember too. In those days, what they would do is they would board ships and they were using ransom to make demands. And in fact, it was Thomas Jefferson who said, "Well, enough of this." So he sent out a mission to do exactly that. You're right. It was the very first naval in the Mediterranean.
Right.
Good. So, let me ask the question back to you this way, because I don't know, the late Sam Huntington talked about the word clash of civilization, and I remember that was. And we never, in the 1990s, you had the one book, The End of It Will Go. Basically saying, I cannot remember the name of the book off the top of my head. But basically, we're saying, okay, we've ended the end of a period, and now we're going to go into more of where democracy and Western civilization takes hold. And then you had Sam Huntington, who basically had a much more dire prediction, saying, in fact, we're on the verge of a clash of civilizations. And he talked about the Islamic civilization. He talked about the Chinese civilization, along with the Western civilizations. And it goes back to the point I made with Herman Kahn, that he predicted there would be a multipolar world where you would have different powers, regional powers, superpowers rising, and that it would not necessarily be a unipolar or a dual polar world, and that's what we're seeing evolving.
Well, and that certainly, it seems to me that one of the things that we really have to start focusing on is that our enemy is no longer our most visible enemy is no longer the Islamic world. It's actually the Chinese world, and that whole idea of a multipolar world order has definitely started to be realized. And frankly, to get back to your other point about vigilance, this whole idea about the next wars are going to be from space, that is really a chilling concept if you think about it, because of all the for example, all the satellites that are up in the air right now in space, something like 95% of them are American, and we have all of our essentially our communication is now directed through the satellites and of course with targets. I mean, there isn't any real defense that has been mounted to protect these assets. And if these guys start going up in the space now, like the Russians are talking, they've always been good at space, and we're now looking at wholesale investment in space war or space capability anyway in China. I mean, this is really this is sobering. I mean, maybe.
Well,
maybe.
Here's the thing. You bring up a good point because, we like to mock what was it, the Space Force that Trump has put together, but if you think about it, space is that next frontier and certainly the Chinese are looking to go back to the moon. India just tried to go to the moon.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how successful they were because they lost communications. And now we're talking about going back to the moon. And
to Mars.
And I think, Mars, but I mean the reality is that when you look at what the capability we have and what the future capability of having a war in space to protect the very satellites we need to be able to conduct a war here on the planet, here on Earth. But even beyond that, it's like you knock those out, you pretty much are knocking out much of what makes America work too.
Yeah.
I mean, your cell phone. I mean, just look at your cell phone. You're not going to be able to use a cell phone. So the very basic aspects of what our economy depends upon today could easily be wiped out in a very short period of time.
It's not just domestic things like cell phones either. It's also the control of our weapons. The control of our weapons that are for both defense and offense are essentially in space right now.
Yeah.
And if these guys start knocking out, you don't have to be a big terrestrial power to start shooting up missiles to if you know exactly the right targets and you have the ability to meet them. A little guy like our friend in North Korea could probably knock out half of New York by one attack. I mean, it's pretty pretty dire.
Yeah, I mean, to me, no, it's not that, but to me, this is you look at these things and you say, well, okay, this sounds like a stupid idea, Space Force in space. Well, no, it's not. Much in the same way Ronald Reagan's vision of Star Wars.
Yeah,
even to this day, it's still a legitimate aspect because you still have nuclear weapons. You still have the ability to lob. I mean, Russia has nuclear weapons. China's got nuclear weapons. You've got North Korea's got weapons, and Iran is working on weapons. So this idea of leaving one defenseless, or let's say the mutually assured destruction aspect, is not exactly it. You can't avoid it, but it also goes back to the idea of ideas. Let me take it a step further. It's one thing to talk about these, but you got to talk about the whole and central aspects of ideas. I think one of the best articles I read a while back, and it was titled, "Maybe the West, Europe, and the United States should ask China, what kind of world does China envision?"
Yeah. Well, they wouldn't tell you.
It's a legitimate question. Yeah, but you look at you look at what the Chinese do with their social control. I mean, I'm reminded of this. I'll tell you a quick story here with the audience. Years and years ago, I took a computer course, and this guy who was teaching the course, he was a devout Christian, and he started talking about, we would go out a little bit afterwards, have discussions, and he was all about 666 and all of this. And he said, people better understand, because we viewed at the time the computer and the internet as the ability to work around, totalitarian governments. That they would, we could communicate and we could, and get past the propaganda. And he said, there'll be a time and a place they will use that to control us.
Yeah.
And if you look in China, that's exactly what's happening. Even if you look at what Facebook, the amount of information that each of us will have on the web, on the internet, what people can control, and what they're able to do, and you see, let's say, for example, the censorship that you see with Google, with conservative groups, or Facebook, or Twitter. Well, this is what's going on in China on a routine basis, but you're seeing it here in the U.S., that kind of control. In other words, A computer is not the great liberator. It may be the greatest slaver if we don't watch ourselves. And when I look at China, and I say, okay, if this is the world they envision, the world they want, then it's time. We need to be asking these kinds of questions, and we're not asking these kinds of questions.
Well, the other factor though is that it's no longer necessary to take territory to win a war. You could reduce a population to starvation and panic and actually diminish them by electronic control of the electronic atmosphere. I mean, it's this is a brave new world. This is
yeah.
I mean, I just hope that our Space Force gets going pretty damn soon, because I think we're going to need it.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Well, you're listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Bachelor News Radio Network.
You might know me, I'm 50 Cent. You may follow my tweets, my Facebook friends. Odds are fewer than 6 degrees separate us. We're that close. What's crazy is 1 in 6 don't know where their next meal is coming from. These are your co-workers, your neighbors, your friends. Hunger's too close for us to ignore. So visit feedingamerica.org/hunger and find your local food bank to see how you can make a difference. From one close friend to another, let's do this. I'm 50 Cent, and together we are Feeding America.
A message from Feeding America and the Ad Council.
Well, you're listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Bachelor News Network, Radio Network, and we've been talking about some ruminations here that are inspired by our consideration of the terrible tragedies that happened 18 years ago today on the East Coast of America. And I've taken a temporary hiatus from my concerns about trying to get a free market healthcare system, which I've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, and I intend to continue because I'm very concerned about it. But this is actually a sort of a super problem that we have to think about once in a while. In fact, we ought to be thinking about it most of the time, and that is what is it that makes America so predominant and so much of a place where everybody in the world seems to want to come and live. And then also, how do we protect that? And how do we, because there are a lot of people that are trying to take it away from us. So we're talking with Tom Donelson tonight, and Tom and I have gone through a number of the ups and downs of the past generation, and we're trying to sort it all out and see how it is we can continue to be optimistic about the future.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this question, Dr. Larry, because you've been an educator and along those lines. And here's the question I'm going to throw back to you, because in order to defend oneself, you have to have an idea worth defending. And one of the things I see within our own culture is a questioning of Western civilization, our own civilization, viewing it in many ways as evil as opposed to, or even neutral as opposed to, of a positive good for the world. And I do think that that's an issue that we need to start, start talking about in detail. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that the whole issue of religion has obviously has and many of them are cultural as opposed to simply doctrinal. I think that the practice of religion, in terms of the fellowship and the public reverence of the universe and of the Creator, and the value of the redemption that the Christians and at least have endured, that all has had enormous impact on the development of our culture as well. And for example, the whole idea of what's the fundamental difference between many of the non-Christian cultures in the history of the world and our culture. One of the major fundamental differences is that Christianity preaches that every person is a son or daughter of God, which means that they're all equal and that they are all to be revered. That is a concept that is not very common in many cultures in the history of the world. And because of that, we have developed a whole civilization that cherishes human freedom and human dignity and the rights of human beings to be counted and to be given due respect and due opportunities. So much of the traditional optimism that we have experienced in America and in the Western world in general has to do with it has its roots in our religion. Now, when people are starting to take religion either as a negative force or at least as in many times just kind of an irrelevant force, I think that is bound eventually to erode the sense of a new day and a new place and a new and a better life that we have traditionally adhered to, and I see that happening. I think it's happening because there are certain characteristics of our current culture that are very humanistic, and they're very concrete and visible. They can't see God, and they can't see goodness, and they can't see that human beings are all good. Because they see a lot of bad in human beings, and because of this, they tend to reject the invisible world, so to speak. And I think that has an impact on the acceptance of traditional religion. I think traditional religion also has been very, very lax in attempting to express itself in a more concrete and practical way. And frankly, this is a book that I've threatened to write myself, because I think there are ways of talking about God and days of talking about goodness and about salvation and about history and about human beings that are far more impactful than the ceremonies of the past.
Yeah, that's an aspect of it, and I also think a second aspect is the teaching of history. I kind of like to say, we a lot of students have been given the Howard Zinn version of history, which is a negative aspect of history as opposed to the more positive side of America. And again, being positive does not necessarily mean you brush off what we've done wrong. You don't, slavery as a part of it, as an example. You don't diss that, but you put it in a historical context of where we've been and where we got, and that also seems to be missing. Which is, again, to me, if there's a lesson of 9/11, it's the lesson that we haven't, that we need to be talking about is, first of all, we need to start defending who we are as a people and as a civilization, and point out the fact that, let's put it this way: would you rather have a world dominated by American style of capitalism, freedom? Would you want to be ruled by a Chinese version of freedom?
Or Venezuelan?
Venezuela, yeah.
Well, it's not the linkage between that answer and organized religion is not as clear as it once was. And it seems to me that, if you look back at the history of our religion, when Augustine came along in the 4th and 5th century and started talking about Christianity in a very new and different way, and of course he became a very famous and widely influential interpreter of Christianity. But up until then, you had Jerome and you had the literalists and that were the interpreters of Christianity. And Augustine was a very imaginative and brilliant person, and he reconceptualized a lot of the same ideas. The same thing happened in the 13th century with Thomas Aquinas. And then it happened again in the 1940s with the German school. And frankly, we've got, I think that it's there's an incumbent a responsibility incumbent upon the theologians and the thinkers of contemporary religion that they really need to be more imaginative and more geared toward the current culture that we have. So many of them are people that are really tied down in their thinking to the past, and I just think there's a need for this.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think we're getting to the more esoteric side of the question that needs to be answered. But I can also. It's like last night we had this discussion, dealing with John Bolton, and one of the things I've told people about, Donald Trump, and I had this conversation today with a guy who spent 20 years in the military, and last night, and the point I said, whether you like Donald Trump or not, or whether you even agree with his ideas, he's asking the kinds of questions that need to be asked about where we go from here. Because we're living in a world where, let's say, this is not the 1990s. This is not the Cold War. This is a totally different world. And I said, okay, for example, how long do you stay in Afghanistan? When do you say, okay, we've accomplished our original goal? When do you say, what's the policy in the Middle East? How do we take NATO and put it into the 21st century, knowing full well that even within Europe, there's an intellectual side of the equation that wants the EU to be the counter to the United States as opposed to allies of the United States. We're living with that kind of a world, and we need to be looking at these kinds of answers. And this, again, I like John Bolton, but but to me, the real question is nobody has, we need to be answering these kinds of questions. Where do we take the war on, how do we conduct this war on terror while at the same time looking at potential rivals on the rise?
Well, hold that thought. You're listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Bachelor News Radio Network.
Hello, this is Sandy Eason, the host of Sandy's Secrets. Come and join us, where we will be talking about women's issues of sexuality, sensuality, and self-love. We'll be coming soon, exclusively on the Bachelor Pad Radio Network.
You're listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Bachelor News Radio Network. We're talking to Tom Donelson of the Donelson Files, and Tom's program comes on just before mine on Wednesdays, and also you're also on Tuesdays and Thursdays, are you not?
Just Tuesdays and Wednesdays, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 3 p.m. Pacific Time.
Okay.
And don't
2
forget
days.
you can get both of our, and don't forget you can listen to both of our podcasts on the BachelorPadNetwork.com. So if you want to listen to the show one more time, or the previous show, just tune in and just go on the website and pick your favorite show or favorite shows.
Or favorite host.
Favorite host. Yeah.
Well, I guess part of what I'm thinking about when I talk about finding different language to express our religious beliefs was sort of illustrated in your last discussion there, because you moved very quickly from religion into politics, and that I think is becoming a far more pervasive subject, or it's almost become a substitute for religion in some quarters, particularly on the left, and then of course, and then I guess you could say in some ways on evangelicals and so on the right as well. I think we just, but your basic point about people not thinking very highly anymore, or even very much about religion and particularly morality. I think that people never stop thinking about those things, but they sure don't think about them in the terms that we're familiar with. I think a lot of
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, the point I'm trying to make here is that we need to be re-examining where we want to go into the 21st century, realizing the changes in the world. We've had those conversations with your country's capitalism, on the healthcare, on the various issues, and we've not had that conversation, really in foreign policy. What we are seeing is pretty much, a
new world order.
what we've been. Yeah, it's not just a new world order, but it's more of a case of what is the world as looking at the world and where we need to go, and ask these kinds of questions. Because I think these are questions that people need to be asking and saying, okay, where do we want to go from point A to point B? And understand, okay, here's the obstacles. I mean, I've talked about this in my book, with the Anglosphere, which I thought Brexit, and I still think, is a good opportunity to add and strengthen an aspect of the Western defense of our, the defense of the West, by tying Britain, Australia, the United States, Canada, to basically, I won't say use the word alliance, but a sphere where basically you're looking at like-minded countries that are very powerful economically speaking, that can certainly align themselves with others. For example, a revived Europe/NATO, Japan, a rise of India, and maybe even see India coming into India. In other words, the world is changing, and we need to start thinking along those particular lines. And we
Well, there's no question the world is changing, and I sure don't know how to. I don't know the answer to that question. It seems to me that where America's going is somewhat distinguishable from where a lot of the Europeans are going. Maybe if it's a question of basic values and basic threats, that we're certainly closer to them than we are to the communists. But that's a good question, Tom, and it does deserve some serious consideration. And I suspect we're not going to solve it in the next 2 minutes.
Yeah. No, you're right. We're not going to solve it in the next 2 minutes, but it's the, I find myself, again, it's that aspect that we need to start thinking about where we want to go. Because even within the United States, I mean, if somebody would have told me 20 years ago, 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, that you would have a political party that's basically running right up to Venezuela socialism, I would have said no. There's no, I would have said no way, but that's exactly what you got, a political party that's essentially Venezuela socialism.
Yeah.
And you have ideas that, let's say, you would think have long since been the ass heap of history are suddenly making comebacks. And that's why, these are the kinds of conversations that need to be held.
Well, I agree. I think, I guess I'm kind of an America first approach to that whole problem, because I'm not so sure just where the Europeans are going, and not only that, but I think that there's a lot of other cultivation that can be done in some of the other non-Christian and also non-communist countries, and I'm thinking particularly of India. But I just I don't know the answer to that. I do know that one of the main takeaways that I have from this 9/11 anniversary is that we do have to remember what is so important about our culture and our civilization, and that what that is the fact that we are based upon freedom, and we've got to protect our freedom. And these people that we see running around trying to pretend like that they're qualified to be president are just not the right people to do that. They're not going to protect our freedom. They're going to take our freedom. And I think we've got to stand up against them, and we've got to call them for what they are. They're a bunch of they're idealists, and fine. I have nothing against idealism, but my Lord, you can't give away America's freedom in order to make us if your ideal is an America that is enslaved by the government, that's not something I'm prepared to settle for, and I don't think you are either, and I don't think the American public is. But I'm afraid we're going to have to wind this up, Tom. It's always great to have a conversation that's kind of unbridled by a strict agenda. So, anything you want to say before we sign off?
No, I would say I thank you very much for having me on the show, and I'm going to let you wrap it up and say goodnight.
Well, this is Dr. Larry and the Dr. Larry Show, and we wish you all good night, and we wish that we hope that when the next 9/11 anniversary comes around, that we will all be even safer and better briefed than we are now. Good night, and God bless everybody.